And so you're looking at this pathological situation where America says that, the Biden-Harris administration say that they support Israel's right to defend itself. Well, only if you're playing a sucker's game of defense, because you're allowed to intercept missiles when they're on their way there, like catching a ball or something like that. But, sometimes you miss.
Right.
And that's tough luck, because if you go on offense and you actually, want to push Hezbollah back from the border, if you want to annihilate the Hamas or whatever, then you're anti-peace.
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Carolyn Glick, a very experienced political analyst, reporter, and author of numerous published articles and 2 books, all dealing with Israel and the Middle East. She is also a trusted advisor to decision makers in Israel. Carolyn was born in Houston, Texas, and raised in Chicago, Illinois. She moved to Israel in 1991 when she was 22 years old, and she joined the Israeli Defense Forces that summer. She served in the IDF for 5.5 years, which is way beyond the 2-year requirement for women. After completing her military service in 1997 with the rank of captain, Carolyn served as a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Although she is no longer employed by the Israeli government, she often meets with government officials who seek her advice on important political matters. Carolyn travels worldwide to brief policymakers on issues related to Israel's strategic environment and related topics. She's in the U.S. now on one such trip, and after recording this podcast, she'll be flying to Washington, D.C. to hold discussions with various officials there. We are fortunate to have her here with us today. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Dr. Bob.
Israel is always in the news, but since the invasion by Hamas on October 7th, it seems that, except for the upcoming U.S. election, that there is nothing else on the news. I have so many questions for you, so let's dive right in. Of course, we're going to start with the Middle East and then end up with your thoughts on how the current U.S. election will affect U.S.-Israel relations. First, without revealing confidential information, can you tell us what you hope to accomplish on your upcoming trip to D.C.?
Well, it's a weird time now that, Congress is in session now, but everybody's just thinking about the election, which is less than 2 months away. And I think, for us in Israel, one of the things that's very worrying is, first of all, we're poised on the verge of a major confrontation in Lebanon. We're getting smacked with, over 100 projectiles almost every single day coming in, anti-tank projectiles, which are, armored piercing, and they blow through houses and military bases and all kinds of things. And short range, you can't intercept them. Longer range missiles that have just devastated the landscape of northern Israel and a lot of the towns there. And this just can't go on. We have 80,000 internal refugees who have been out of their houses since the beginning of October, right after the Hamas invasion, because we were afraid that Hezbollah was going to do the same thing in northern Israel. And they can't go home until we've vastly diminished Hezbollah's capacity to invade Israel and to, shoot 20,000, 50,000 short-range missiles into northern Israel. And then they have another 100,000 or so that they can reach all points in Israel. Many of them are precision guided, so we have to take care of that. And you see, the government is talking more and more about the fact that it's imminent now. We passed the point of no return. They've ratcheted up their assaults on Israel. So I think it's very important, because the United States right now in Lebanon, they're paying the salaries of the Lebanese army and the Lebanese intelligence services, and both of them are auxiliary forces to Hezbollah. It's a crazy situation where you have U.S.
Wait a minute, the U.S. is paying, is sending funds to Lebanon's internal security forces, which we know are controlled by Hezbollah.
They're controlled by Hezbollah, and they're funded by U.S. taxpayers. They're armed by U.S. taxpayers, by the U.S. Military suppliers, and they're trained by U.S. special forces in Lebanon, so that you have basically an American supposed proxy force, but they're actually controlled by Hezbollah and Iran. So it's this very weird mishmash where the United States is funding a terrorist force. And they're doing the same thing with the Palestinian Authority, which is, they have all of these security forces that are trained and funded and armed by the United States that are also terrorist groups. They're basically officially terrorist organizations. Most of the terror attacks that have been carried out in that area, in Judea and Samaria, or what's widely known as the West Bank, they're carried out by American-funded security forces. But I'm talking about Lebanon right now. So, it's very important to shine a light on this very unhealthy situation where the United States considers the Lebanese armed forces, the Lebanese government, the Lebanese security, the Lebanese intelligence forces to be aligned with the United States when they're
not
really controlled by Hezbollah
Okay,
and
so
Iran.
who are you going to be talking
So,
to? You don't have to name names, but what level of the government and what message are you going to be delivering?
Stop it. Recognize what's going on here. I'm going to be meeting with senior people on the Hill and with conservative leaders and things like that. It just this is something that has to end. People don't want to give foreign aid. Fine. So why don't you start by not funding terrorist organizations? That would be a good place to start. For instance, let's talk a little bit about Lebanon. Let's talk about the Palestinian Authority. I mentioned that earlier, but I mean, the United States, U.S. taxpayers pay $500 million a year, more or less, actually more, but whatever, to the Palestinian Authority, which is supposed to be a moderate governing authority of the Palestinians that the United States would like to become the government of an independent state of Palestine. But the Palestinian Authority is just as devoted to the annihilation of Israel as Hamas is. There's really no ideological disparity between the two in terms of their ultimate goals or even immediate goals. And moreover, you find that we've had a massive uptick in terrorist activity, terrorist attacks against Israelis in Judea and Samaria and emanating from Judea and Samaria. We've had, I think, 5 car bombings in the past 2 weeks in Judea and Samaria, and then they had another one that was attempted in suicide bombing that was attempted in Tel Aviv. And so we had... and all of these, I think 10 Israelis have been killed in the past 2 weeks in terrorist attacks. So, for instance, about 10 days ago, 3 Israeli policemen were murdered when a Palestinian terrorist ambushed their vehicle and shot them at a crossing. And it worked out that the shooter was a member of, or a former member, they're always former members of the Palestinian Authority's what's called the Presidential Guard, which is one of their elite units. And the Presidential Guard is trained by the United States. And the guy was very, very skilled in what he did. So odds are that he was trained by Americans. And then he went and he murdered 3 other policemen. By the way, one of them, his name is... I think Avner Shkori, his daughter was murdered or killed in battle on October 7th. She was also a police officer defending the police station in Sderot. So her poor mother first lost her daughter and then lost her husband, both killed in the line of duty as police officers in the Israeli police force. And one was killed by Hamas terrorists who invaded Israel, and the other one was killed by a U.S. trained terrorist in south of Hebron.
Was he eliminated?
I think so, but I can't remember for sure. So the thing is that on both of these fronts, you see that the United States is ostensibly siding with Israel. But in fact, when you look down at a more granular level of what the United States is doing, at a minimum, they're playing both sides against each other. We see the same thing in Gaza. We had we had a recording and intercepted communications of Hamas terror commanders, and they were bragging about how because of all of the humanitarian assistance, they've made 500 million shekels, about $100 million or something like that, since October 7th, selling this humanitarian aid supplies that the United States is funding, that the United States has forced Israel to bring in, and they hoard it, and they're fully supplied. Obviously, they can fight until kingdom come because of the humanitarian aid, which they control.
Yep.
And then they sell it on black markets, they sell it on the open market, and this is how they make their money, and this is how they retain control over Gaza. It's through this fake humanitarian aid. And they kill anybody who who's hungry and complains about it. They just killed somebody last week, and
A Palestinian.
yeah, in Gaza. And so you're looking at this pathological situation where America says that the Biden-Harris administration say that they support Israel's right to defend itself. Well, only if you're playing a sucker's game of defense, because you're allowed to intercept missiles when they're on their way there, like catching a ball or something like that. But sometimes you miss.
Right.
And that's tough luck, because if you go on offense and you actually, want to push Hezbollah back from the border, if you want to annihilate the Hamas or whatever, then you're anti-peace.
That goes directly into my next area of questioning. Well, so with regard to the Gaza war, everyone agrees that Israel has the right to defend itself. That's saying the obvious. Every country or person or even an animal, when attacked, has the right to defend itself. But when many politicians state that Israel has the right to defend itself, they often qualify it with statements about the need to be proportional or the requirement to limit the harm to non-combatants. And as soon as Israel started to react to the invasion, we heard instantly demands from countries around the world for a ceasefire. Well, Carolyn, on October 6th, there was a ceasefire. And how did that turn out?
No, you're absolutely.
So I want to ask you, why are so many countries demanding that Israel cease fire when they aren't demanding that in other conflicts, such as the war between Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for years, they're not demanding a ceasefire there? A ceasefire is a tie, Carolyn. Doesn't Israel have the right to win this war and put an end to Hamas's aggression once and for all?
Well, I mean, you and I think that Israel has a right to defend to win. In fact, it's not just that we think that Israel has a right to win. Israel has an imperative to win, because what we saw was that on October 7th, this was sort of this wasn't that surprising for Israelis whose family moved from Arab countries. What we saw on October 7th, the mass rape, the mutilation, tearing babies out of their mothers' bellies of pregnant women, burning babies, burning children, burning families together, all of the atrocities that we saw, and the kidnapping. This happened in Iraq in 1941. There was a massive pogrom where they killed somewhere between 800 and 1,000 Jews. And if you listen to the descriptions of what they did to the Jews of Baghdad and Basra in what was called the Farhud, it's very, very similar to what we experienced on October 7th. Same thing in Morocco. We had, incidents. We had mass attacks like this over hundreds of years. Same thing in Yemen and in other Arab countries. But, I guess what was unique here is that the Jews who suffered from it were Jews whose families didn't come. They came from Europe. They didn't come from Arab countries. So it was sort of Arabs meet Western Jews for the first time, and then they saw what happens when we're under their power. And what they showed was that when you talk about from the river to the sea, you're talking about October 7th, because the idea is that Jews are supposed to live at the mercy of the Muslims and not in any other way. So Jews aren't allowed to defend themselves. Jews have to be subjugated. Dhimmis, exactly. That's the term of second-class citizens in Islam. And, women are raped. Women are taken as chattel. And everything that we saw, this is part of the sort of jihad doctrine of how you deal with Jews, how do you deal with non-Muslims in general, but particularly Jews. And this is what they're after. And so when you can't, by its very nature, by the nature of these societies and how they perceive Jews and what they want to do when they talk about annihilating Israel, you understand that there is no getting to yes and sort of a Harvard negotiating kind of mantra. This is a zero-sum game. Either they win and we're annihilated and subjugated and live in constant terror if we're still allowed to live, or we win and they can't hurt us again. And you have to choose. You can't reach a diplomatic settlement with people,
of course,
who do this
barbarians.
to you.
Barbarians.
Yeah, I mean, they give barbarism a bad name, frankly. And, what happened on October 7th was not an aberration. That's what I'm trying to say. Over just the past, since the breakdown of the fake peace process that we had with the Palestinians, and I was a negotiator in the Israeli negotiating team when I was in the army. And, when that broke down finally in 2000, I mean, it never worked, but they were enacting the atrocities of October 7th just on a smaller level, one family at a time, suicide bombings, going into a family's house. We had, babies killed in their cribs.
I remember.
And we had babies killed with their mothers. And, we had all these things, but it was one family at a time. And here you had full communities that were overrun with hundreds of people murdered in each community. And, of course, what happened at the dance festival, at the Nova Festival, to the young people, this was catastrophic. This was something that, we had never experienced, but this is something that we'll experience over and over again. Why is it that there are 80,000 refugees from the north living in hotel rooms all over the country? It's because Hezbollah published their plan for the invasion of the Galilee in 2018. And what we saw in southern Israel along the border with Gaza was an enactment of Hezbollah's plan. So it was both of Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy, Hamas is an Iranian proxy, so they're all doing the same thing. So obviously the understanding was that if Hamas is invaded, then Hezbollah is about to invade and do the exact same thing to the Galilee, which is why everybody had to be immediately evacuated from their homes. And, our family, my husband has 4 uncles who live in Kiryat Shmona with their children and grandchildren all in surrounding areas, and they've all been in hotels since then, and it's a horrible thing, and yet they can't go home. If you look at Kiryat Shmona now, you have, or Metula, or any of the kibbutzim along, you have hundreds and hundreds of homes that that have been blown up. The landscape, like I said, it's one of the most beautiful, my personal favorite area of Israel, and the landscape has been altered. We had the Berea forest last week was up in flames, and not for the first time. And this is, that's the whole point, is that there is no diplomatic solution. Just today, I think his name is Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesman. He said of, the war talk about Lebanon. Oh, no. First he said, we believe that the best solution is a diplomatic solution. And then he went back and he said the only one. But that's a lie. That's a chimera. There is no diplomatic solution. I think the point is that it's hard for Americans sometimes to recognize that this isn't a negotiation. And I guess everything is a negotiation, but the negotiation is about who gets to live. It's not a negotiation about how do we split the spoils. There is no way to make There's bigger pie.
I always say, if somebody wants to kill you and you want to stay alive, there's no middle ground.
No, and that's exactly where we are.
And it's obvious. And October 7th made it obvious, right?
Which is what makes it so appalling, that they want to force us back into this conversation, which was a lie in the 1990s when we started it.
Of course, the Oslo Accords were a fraud to start with. To have the Prime Minister of Israel shake hands with Yasser Arafat, when at the same time, in English, he was saying all the right things for Americans to hear. But I belong to an organization I support called Memory, which records the actual speeches given in Arabic to the media and to the people in those countries, and it's the other side of the coin. And matter of fact, I believe I recall Arafat saying in Arabic, "Don't pay attention to what I say in English.
Right.
That's just for the Americans to hear and for the Jews in America to hear. But really, we'll get whatever we can by negotiation, and then we'll finish it by force."
It's true. And when I was
in his own words.
Yep. And when I was in the negotiations, I coordinated all the negotiations on civil affairs. We were transferring military power and we were governing power.
Right.
And so
The
my
schools,
team was
picking up the garbage,
everything, and infrastructure, building and zoning, all of those things. So with transportation, roads. So the thing was that after a while, I'm looking at this and I'm getting all these reports from the ground, and we see that the Palestinians, we were negotiating, we had all these lawyers there, saying, should we write it? How do we draft it, Carolyn? The English speaker should be, the parties shall do this, or the parties will do this. And I'm like, oh my God. And then because lawyers, but then you find out on the ground, the Palestinians were breaching everything. They weren't keeping their commitment on anything, large or small, nothing.
Within days.
Never. And so I started putting out these reports every 2 weeks or so about the Palestinian breaches of the agreement, and all the peaceniks got really mad at me because I keep putting it out.
Right.
And I keep saying they're not doing anything. Carolyn, who told you to write that? Oh, I was told. Who was told me? My
common sense told you.
I told myself, but I'll just say I was told because I was only a captain. I didn't want to get in trouble. I was told, and leave it in the passive voice. And that was that. But it drove people crazy because they didn't want to know, because they wanted to believe that at the end there would be peace, that it didn't matter the here and now. What mattered, what was where we were going. We were walking to somebody. You have to understand, though, in this world, and whether it's with the Hezbollah or Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, the future is told by what they're doing today. And what you've seen with the Palestinians of all stripes, whether it's Fatah, Palestinian Authority, official forces, whether it's Islamic Jihad, Hamas, any new name that they put on what they're doing, the road to wherever it is always the same road, and it's always going in the same direction. Right. Exactly. Killing a maximum number of Jews, inducing terrorism, delegitimizing Israel, rewriting history, denying Israeli Jewish history in the land of Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. It's always the same. So if it's always the same and never changing, how can anybody imagine for even a moment that it'll ever change?
I know, but the left imagines that.
Well, and the Americans,
The left in Israel holds daily protests against the government, demanding that Netanyahu give in to any condition that Hamas demands in order to get the hostages back. The left, don't they realize that the architect of the Hamas invasion was Yahya Sinwar? He was one of the 1,000 prisoners that Israel released back in 2011 to get back a single soldier, Gilad Shalit, who they had kidnapped. Had Israel not released Sinwar back then, the invasion on October 7th might not have ever occurred. So what is the motivation of the left in Israel? What are they thinking?
That's a good question. I just want to back up for a second. So what we saw with Gilad Shalit and that crazy deal, we also had mass protests and in the months leading up to that insane deal, which was obviously going to lead to a cataclysmic end.
Obviously, the people who were released were not just prisoners, petty thieves. No. These, among the 1,000, were
1,027.
1,027,
yes.
Right, for one Israeli soldier. Right. And among those were murderers, were people who were convicted, who had blood on their hands, right? And we let them go, including Sinwar.
Right. So the thing is that they were rioting and this, and he's all of our sons. And I remember I wrote an article at the time saying, look, we know that if we do this deal, then hundreds of Israelis are going to be killed, and
because of this, right?
Multitudes are going to be taken hostage. The only difference between them and Gilad Shalit, the soldier who was hostage in Gaza, is that we know his name and we don't know theirs.
Of the
but
other
can't
100.
we spare a little bit of concern for them? Because they could be every single one of us. They could be every single one of our children. And, nobody wanted to hear the voice of reason because it was political then. They were trying to oust Netanyahu from power then. And it's the same thing now. So you ask about now. So if the Gilad Shalit deal led to October 7th, taking 256 hostages on October 7th, now there are 101, probably around 65 of them are still assumed to be alive. You're saying you take these number of hostages that caused October 7th. This is a strategic collapse completely. This is Israel losing a war for its national survival. That's what they're demanding.
Correct.
I mean, the deal that they are demanding that Israel accept is Hamas's terms of hostage release, which is a total capitulation of Israel, a complete strategic defeat in a war for our national survival. And why are they doing this? Because, and you have a similar situation here with the Trump haters, with the Trump derangement syndrome. In Israel, we have a Bibi derangement syndrome, where hatred is a very powerful tool for political organizing. And if you're able to organize political camps around hatred, it's very difficult for them to see anything else. And so what we've had with the Israeli left, particularly in the past 5 or 6 years, but really going back to when Netanyahu was first elected prime minister in the 1990s, is that you have the left as a political camp is organized around hatred of Netanyahu and his voters. And they've been so incited over the past 5 years in particular in hatred on the left that they hate Netanyahu more than they hate Sinwar.
Netanyahu was blamed for the recent killing by Hamas of those 5 or 6 hostages.
6.
They blame Netanyahu.
Yes.
It's his fault.
Yeah. I mean, look, the Biden administration blames Netanyahu for it as well, which is, and the whole thing is deranged. Just as the Gilad Shalit deal was immoral and deranged, what they're talking about now is also deranged and immoral because, there's never been a yes on the Hamas side, of these crazy negotiations with Hamas. Why anybody thinks that we can have any negotiations with Hamas after October 7th is beyond me. But, okay, so we're doing that. The Hamas never agreed to a deal, ever. They've made one claim, one demand for a deal, total Israeli capitulation, which includes all Israeli forces out of Gaza, everywhere, including the international border. It's emptying Israeli jails of all the Hamas and Fatah and Islamic Jihad terrorists that are sitting there convicted or awaiting trial or whatever, including the terrorists who carried out the atrocities on October 7th, letting all of them go home. And
they'll be good guys, right?
No, they won't. And they're not even pretending it. So they're saying total Israeli capitulation, total Israeli surrender. And in exchange, they'll give us some of the hostages. Because right now what's on the table is letting a fifth of the hostages, and we don't even know how many of them will be released alive. That's all we're talking about. So this is Hamas's only position. They've never moved from it. So when people are demanding that Netanyahu accept a deal and that it's his fault that Hamas executed 6 innocents, what are we talking about? This is pure madness. There's no reasoning with these people because they're so beyond. Beyond rationality.
Many of them are Jews, right?
No, not only are they Jews, they're Israeli, and they're the leaders in many cases of Israeli. They're the wealthiest people in Israel. They're retired generals, retired chiefs of staff. So they're the elite of Israel, and they're so driven by this incredible derangement that they're making these. They've adopted positions that are suicidal from a national perspective, you just have to tell them no.
I so admire Prime Minister Netanyahu's determination In the face of intense pressure, both internationally and domestically, what he wants to do and what he's persisting in is to eliminate Hamas and win this war. Do you think he'll continue on that course, or will he give in to the pressure from the U.S. to end the war before it's won?
I don't think he's going to give in to pressure. Everybody, all of these critics of Netanyahu are saying, he's driven by political considerations. He's only thinking about politics. Everything that he's doing is all about politics. And the exact opposite is like they're projecting themselves onto him. It's a constant projection. All they care about are politics. They don't care about Israel, obviously, because they want us to capitulate in a war for our survival. I mean, again, this isn't a war because, we just feel like it. Nobody feels like it. We've lost 700 soldiers. In my community alone, we've lost 5. In every boys' high school, we have 3 boys' high schools. So just in my community of 10,000 people, there are 3 high schools, and each one of them is 1 lost 5, 1 lost 6, 1 lost 4. I mean, we're talking about everybody's kids. I mean, we went to funerals day after day. Our son was fighting in Gaza for over 250 days. Everybody there's no degree of separation between basically the entire country and the war. And, what Netanyahu is doing is the minimum that would be expected of any prime minister, and there are no political considerations in what he's doing. He's fighting the whole world. He's fighting these crazy people at home who can't see past their own tunnel vision, and he's fighting the United States administration, the Biden-Harris administration, that's saying, you're not allowed to do anything except catch missiles,
Right.
And if they fall, so be it. Tough luck.
That's war.
What are you going to do? War is hell, right? But you're not allowed to go after your enemies. He's fighting everybody. The only reason we've gotten as far as we have is because of his grit and the incredible heroism of our soldiers and the line officers who are commanding them. It's an incredible tribute, but you have this layer in the middle that's trying to undermine everything that we need to do in order to survive, and you have this international community. The United States is the best of them in terms of any grudging acceptance of Israel's right to defend itself. You have the entire international protean chorus of Jew haters running around, whether it's the UN or the EU or whatever, saying, we're going to they have embargoes on wars, on arms to Israel.
Right.
Why? What are you doing?
Right.
You have them, rioting in the cities of Germany, walking around with knives and slicing up and dicing up people on the streets and policemen. What do you think is going to happen to you in Britain or in France? I mean, you already know. They're already happening now.
It's happening now.
And you think that the Muslims who are attacking your people in Europe, or in America for that matter, are going to stop if you sacrifice the Jews? Of course not. It's just going to whet their appetite, just like it whet their appetite for more in Israel after we had the Shalit deal.
Exactly.
Success begets success, and if you're giving them, a tailwind, right, to push them forward, then where do you think that they're going to go? They're going to go to you. You're stupid. I mean, aside from being just, also you are blinded by hate. You hate Jews. So you're saying that the Jews don't have any right to defend themselves, because I guess you prescribe to the Islamic view that Jews are allowed to be second-class citizens, but God forbid we should defend ourselves. So I think, when you look at the international response to this, it's very frightening. Really? This is what you come up with? This is how you really respond to the massacre of Jews?
And the International Court is going to sanction...
They're trying us for genocide.
Yeah, they're trying us, right, for genocide.
And again, projection, right? It's all projection. We had a one-day genocide in Israel on October 7th, and now the Jews are being accused of genocide. Do you know what the fatality rate of civilian to terrorists is in Gaza?
Right. It's very low.
It's less than 1 to 1.
Right.
It's the lowest in human history.
In any war, right.
In human history, in the history of warfare, there's never been a lower ratio of combatants to non-combatants in any war.
Right.
And Israel, Kamala Harris said too many have died. And the ABC News lady who did the debate, she said she cited Hamas's fake figures of 40,000. But even if they were true, 17,000 of them are terrorists. So that's almost 1-to-1, and it's actually less than 1-to-1. So you're using fake figures from a terrorist organization that if you even spent 1 second examining them, you would see that you have nothing to accuse Israel of except, playing by rules of etiquette that make no sense.
Nobody else follows.
So good for you,
Right.
ABC. This is what you come up with: a propagandist for Hamas, pretending to be a journalist, moderating a presidential debate. Good for you, Democrats. This is what you come up with: the front runner to be next president of the United States, who, says too many have been killed. So what are you saying? That it's okay to murder 1,200 Israelis in one day, steal 256 people from their homes, bring them to Gaza to be slaves and murdered? But, we can't respond with minimal force. Is that what you're saying? But Israel is allowed to. You know what I call the defense school that they're talking about? On October 7th, there was an incredible hero named Aner Shapira. And he was a soldier in the Nachal Infantry Brigade, and he was on furlough, and he went to the Nova Festival. And right as the air raid sirens came, at 6:30 in the morning, he was contacted by his commander, said, you have to come to the base not far from there that was also being overrun. So he's trying to get to his unit, and he ends up stopping at one of the shelters because they're coming under attack from all of these missiles. So he's hiding in this shelter with many, many other people who had run away from the Nova Music Festival. And then they see that the terrorists are coming, that it's actually a ground invasion, not just projectiles. And he's standing at the entrance of the shelter with a glass shard in his hand
As a weapon.
As a weapon, because that's all he has. And then the terrorists start throwing hand grenades into the shelter, and he caught 8 of them and threw them out. And the Hamas guys, they videoed it on their GoPro camera, so you saw the whole thing. Or actually, it was a car camera. People have it in their front window, and so it was this car that had the people in it were murdered, but the camera was still running, and so that was how it was all captured. So this kid, he's like 21 years old. He's throwing out the 8 of them, and the 9th one he caught, but it exploded in his hand, and he died. And so what I refer to as the Aner Shapira defense model. This is not a model for a country, and it didn't end well for the kids who were in the shelter, right? 7 of them out of like 75 survived. So when you're talking about allowing Israel to intercept missiles on the way to Israel,
like
you're saying all of us have to be Aner Shapira of blessed memory, and that's not acceptable.
Didn't work for him, and it's not going to work for us.
It doesn't work for anybody in the end, because too many get through.
Yeah. Talking about weapons that get through, let's talk about Egypt. Now, we always suspected that Egypt was not monitoring the flow of weapons through Egypt to Gaza, as it had committed to do in a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. But now that Israel has taken over the Philadelphia corridor and has discovered the large tunnels between Egypt and Gaza, we have proof that those tunnels were a major source of weapons for Hamas. Do you think Egypt was aware of the smuggling of weapons into Gaza and perhaps was even involved in the smuggling?
So, yeah. I think, and we have to understand here that something changed in Egypt over the past 10 years. First of all, on October 7th, Israel, it just shows the level of the failure of our intelligence people, but Israel was taken aback by the amount of firepower Hamas had amassed in Gaza. People hadn't expected it to be that enormous. And they realized that it had to have been coming from Egypt, because where else would it come from?
Right.
It's not all domestic military production, obviously, and they're not getting it from the sea because that's under maritime blockade. So that only leaves one option, which is Egypt. And so that was when we started realizing that something had gone awry. Because in 2014, after, you have to see, remember the Arab Spring?
Yeah, sure.
Right? So that was when all these Muslim Brotherhood groups started overthrowing these sort of what are referred to as status quo Arab regimes. So it happened, in Tunis, and then it happened in Egypt. And the Obama administration actually supported the Muslim Brotherhood.
That was the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right. The Muslim Brotherhood ousted longtime Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, who had really been the anchor of the American alliance system with the Sunni Arab world for 3 decades. He was president for 29 years. And he was ousted by the Muslim Brotherhood. They had a president named Mohammed Morsi, who was in charge of Egypt 2012, 2013. Then he was ousted from power by the military. They said, never mind, because Egypt was about to become an Islamic republic. And so the Morsi regime was just, Hamas is by declaration, they are the official Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Egyptian and the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood were obviously working together. They're the same organization. So Hamas was helping the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to overthrow Mubarak, and then the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt was helping Hamas with arms. And then when they were overthrown in 2013 by the Egyptian military, we got the man who is still president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was the chief of staff of the army, was the defense minister, and he came in and became the president. Okay. So in 2014, Hamas, with all the arms that they got from Egypt and everything else, they started a war with Israel. And Sisi at that time, he was freshly, inaugurated into office, and Israel was supporting him against the Muslim Brotherhood, and Israel was lobbying the Obama administration and Congress to restore arms to Egypt that they had embargoed after the military overthrew Morsi. So we were very much aligned. And
with Assisi.
With Assisi. And Assisi, together with the UAE, the Saudis, they were siding with Israel against Hamas.
Muslim
that was being supported in 2015, the same way they are today, by Qatar and Turkey, which are both also Muslim Brotherhood regimes. So the Qataris and the Turks were supporting Hamas, and Israel was shocked. I mean, many people were shocked by this, that actually Israel was supported diplomatically by the Egyptians and by the Saudis and the UAE. And that was the beginning of what became the Abraham Accords, and we're just celebrating their 4th anniversary this week. But that was the beginning of the Abraham Accords, was that war between Israel and Hamas. And so you had this situation where Sisi was our friend. And I think that lulled us into complacency, because over time, Obama and then Biden were pushing policies that were pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and change, and the Egyptian regime started becoming less averse to the Muslim Brotherhood. And then you had an additional economic issue, which is that Sisi's son, Mahmoud al-Sisi, is a general in the Egyptian intelligence services. And what we've discovered is that he became sort of a silent partner in this conglomerate called the El Organi Group, which is controlled by a Bedouin chief in the Sinai Peninsula, which is the part of Egypt that borders Gaza. And the El Organi Group controls the border on the Egyptian side with Gaza, and they make money. I don't know, you want to call them kickbacks, you want to call them bribes, you want to call them payments, whatever. So everything that goes from Egypt into Gaza,
this family makes money.
Or anybody from outside, from Gaza who comes into Egypt,
they have to pay.
The Organi Group gets a cut.
Right.
And then you find out that Sisi's son is sort of a silent partner in that. So you see that there's also an economic interest going on here. So you have the economics, you have changes in the cultural complexion due to shifts in American policy, and you have a situation where on October 7th we were faced with a shocking situation where Sisi was siding effectively with Hamas against Israel. He wasn't allowing any people in Gaza to
leave
leave the war zone,
Right.
either to stay in Egypt for the duration or to transit to a third country. He said,
No.
if anybody comes through, I'm going to abrogate the peace treaty. And he's been threatening that repeatedly since October 7th. What are the Americans doing in this? The only reason that, the Americans brokered that treaty. The only reason that the Americans support Egypt at all is because of the peace treaty.
Peace treaty, right.
So why aren't the United States threatening to cut off Egypt? Because they're threatening the peace treaty. They're not, because the Biden administration has a policy that's very sympathetic towards the Muslim Brotherhood.
Sure. That's all Obama's administration.
Yes, well,
Right, as
there you
we
go.
know.
So that's where we are today.
Well, we have still so much to talk about. We'll continue our discussion with Carolyn Glick. And this is the end of part 1. We'll be back with part 2.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoy these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.